Hello, and today we're going to be reviewing the Ryobi P505B 18-volt budget circular saw, so let's get started. And starting off on the right side of the tool, we have the 18-volt battery slot. The battery slot will accept any of Ryobi's 18-volt batteries, and overall the slot is nice and secure. I haven't had any issues with batteries accidentally falling out, and there is very little wiggle once the battery is fully inserted. So overall, the battery slot is acceptable on this tool. Next up, we have the spindle lock. Overall, the spindle lock is adequate. However, I personally would have preferred it to be placed towards the rear of the body and not on the front. It makes it a little bit awkward when you need to change the blade, but like I said, it is adequate. And at the bottom of the circular saw, we have the base plate. Now, overall, the base plate is made out of metal, and this is a good thing. Unfortunately, it appears to be some sort of metal which can rust because they've decided to paint it black. Overall, I'm not a huge fan of having a painted base plate simply because it starts to look like something that's made out of a high school parking lot or out of a demolition derby after a few uses. I personally prefer the all-aluminum base plates simply because they look better over time. It's hard for them to get scratched up, and you won't have to worry about rust. So overall, it's adequate, but that's about all I can say for that portion of the base plate. Now, at the top of the base plate, we have a width guide that in between 1 and 4 inches, as well as the 0-degree notch and the 45-degree notch, and a 1-inch width scale on the left side. So overall, it is a fairly average base plate, at least when it comes to a circular saw, but it's more than adequate for getting the job done, so it gets a pass. The circular saw does have a place where you can attach a rip fence or rip guide. Unfortunately, they do not include the rip guide or fence, nor do they include the knob in order to attach the rip guide or fence to the circular saw. I can maybe see not including the rip guide or rip fence, but why not include the knob? That's a little bit too cheap, Ryobi. Come on. And next up, we have the bevel adjustment knob. Overall, the bevel adjustment knob does a fairly good job at keeping the base plate where you want it to be when you're making a bevel cut. Overall, this is a useful feature, but it really is only useful, at least on this particular circular saw, when you're working with a board that's 1 inch or less. If you are working with a 2x4, you're going to be out of luck unless the cut you're trying to make is under 18 degrees. And that all has to do with the fact that it's a 5.5-inch blade, and it just won't make it all the way through because of how small the blade is. And next up, we have the 5.5-inch blade with 18 TPI with carbide-tipped teeth. Overall, it does a fairly decent job at cutting through boards that are 1 inch or less. Think of like plywood, OSB, shelving boards, you know, that sort of thing. And it will still cut a 2x4 as long as it's a straight cross cut and with no sort of bevel. So overall, it does a reasonable job, and it gets a pass here. And next up, we have the blade guard. Now, the blade guard is made out of a transparent plastic with a clear plastic handle for when you need to manually operate the guard. Overall, it does a fairly decent job. The only thing I would probably change is to maybe make the handle a little bit longer. But it still does a good job at keeping your hands or other body parts away from the blade when it's spinning and you're not cutting something. But just keep in mind that the best way of keeping yourself safe is to be aware of what you're doing and where you're putting your hands and not to become complacent. But overall, the blade guard is good on this particular circular saw. And next up, we have the pommel grip. Overall, the pommel grip has a nice rubberized texture to it, and it feels fairly nice in my hands. I will say that it might be a little bit small for somebody who has larger sized hands, but at least for me personally, I think it works fairly well. It's nice and stout, and you don't really have to worry about it getting in the way either. So overall, it gets a pass from me. And next up, we have the circular saw handle. Now, overall, the circular saw handle is fairly nice on this particular circular saw, and it does a good job of keeping your hands in place with that rubberized finish. And it's big enough that you can wear gloves while operating it if you so choose to. So overall, it gets a pass. And next up, we have the safety switch. Now, the safety switch actually is fairly nice on this circular saw, and you can operate it from either the right side or the left side. So overall, I have to say I am a huge fan of the safety switch on this particular circular saw, and I really think Ryobi did a good job here. So overall, it definitely gets a pass. Next up, we have the trigger. Now, the trigger is fairly basic. It's a single speed trigger, so once you press it and the motor engages, there's no variable speeds anywhere, which is standard for a circular saw. But it does also have a nice rubberized texture to it, which will help keep your fingers on the trigger for if your hand gets sweaty or if your hands are wet. So overall, I have to say that this is another good feature of the circular saw, so another pass. And next up, we have the blade depth knob. Overall, the blade depth knob does a good job of keeping the blade depth to wherever you set it at, as long as you tighten it enough. And there's also a blade depth scale that has white markings or white numbers, so you can easily set it to whatever depth you need when you're working with a dimensional lumber type, as long as you know the dimensions of the lumber. I will say that maybe the arrow that points to what you need it set could be a little bit clearer, but other than that, there really is nothing wrong with it. And I really do appreciate that Ryobi took the extra effort to include this feature. So overall, it gets a pass. And next up, we have the onboard Allen key or Allen wrench storage. Now overall, this is a super useful feature, and it's one that I think most brands should adopt, simply because of how useful it is. When you need to find an Allen wrench or Allen key, you never seem to be able to find one simply because, well, some little gremlin ran off with it, or it didn't get put back in the right place, your own fault, or it's been rounded off to the point of not being useful anymore. Well, that possibly could be your own fault as well. But overall, I have to say this is a super useful feature, and I really enjoy having this built onto the tool. So at the end of the day, this is a major benefit of this particular circular saw, just for the ease of use, or ease of change, I should say. Okay, let's talk about the kind of power that this circular saw has. Overall, this little circular saw does have a decent amount of power for when you're working with thinner boards, such as OSB, plywood, shelving material, or just that sort of thing. It will work with 2x4s as long as you're not pushing it too hard, and it does a reasonable job at, well, finishing the job in a timely manner. Now, it's not going to be as fast as something from DeWalt or Milwaukee, but at the same time, you are dealing with a budget circular saw from Ryobi, so that is to be expected. Overall, I haven't had really any major issues when using this saw, and it's accomplished most of the jobs I've wanted it to accomplish. So overall, I have to say that it does get a pass here, as long as you understand the amount of power and you know what to expect when you're getting the circular saw. If you go in with the wrong expectations of what the circular saw can handle, then you probably will be disappointed. But for me personally, I knew what to expect, and it's handled everything that I expected it to be able to handle. So overall, I've been happy with its performance. Now the tool weighs without a battery 2,085 grams, or about 4.5 pounds. And with a 4 amp hour battery, it weighs 2,084 grams, or a little over 6 pounds. Okay, let's talk about the pros and cons. Okay, first pro would be price. It's currently priced at $39.97, and I think the reason for this would be the fact that they've announced a new model which will be replacing this model. Now, the new model really isn't anything special, and the real-world specs or real-world performance will probably be about the same. The new model can cut a little bit faster maybe, and has a little bit different cutting depth, but honestly, in real-world performance, you probably won't be able to tell a difference. So if it was up to me, I would get the old model and save some money. Next up, 18 volts. 18 volts means that you'll have plenty of power to finish most jobs, and if you so choose to, you can adapt batteries over from another brand via an adapter. So overall, I would definitely consider this to be a pro. Next up, rubberized grips. If you've ever used a circular saw that doesn't have rubberized grips, you'll understand why I consider this to be a pro, and considering the price point, this is definitely a nice feature, so it's a pro. Decent build. Considering the price point, this circular saw actually has a fairly decent build quality to it, and overall I've been happy with just how well it's held up, so overall it's a pro. Lightweight. Overall, this circular saw is fairly lightweight, and overall it is easy to use, so overall this is definitely a pro in my opinion. Onboard Allen key. Having the onboard Allen key definitely makes this a lot easier to use when you need to change that blade and you're working in a remote location, or you just can't find an Allen key to fit the blade slot. So overall, I have to say that I am a huge fan of having the onboard Allen key. And the first and only man would be power. Overall, it has plenty of power, and it'll finish all the jobs you can throw at least for what you would expect a 5.5-inch saw to be able to handle. But then again, it would be nice to have a little bit more power, but it's not enough of a con to actually make it onto a con list, so that's why it's on the meh list. So, moving on. No rip fence or guide. The fact that Ryobi doesn't even include the knob to attach a rip fence or guide is really irritating, and the fact that it doesn't seem to take a universal rip fence or guide is also irritating. For me personally, I really think that Ryobi needs to include the onboard knob for attaching one of these, at least, and if they include the rip fence itself, I think that would also be a really nice thing to do. So at the end of the day, I would definitely consider this to be a con. And that is it for the pros and cons. Final thoughts on this particular circular saw. Overall, this particular circular saw has more than enough power to finish most of the jobs that I've thrown at it. Now, I will say that I personally prefer using a 6.5-inch circular saw to a 5.5-inch circular saw, but for a kit saw or for a cheap circular saw, this one does do a decent job. It will do a good job when you're working with plywood or OSB, and it will cut a 2x4 in half as long as you're not trying to do any sort of bevel cutting. So overall, it does come recommended, and I would definitely get this one over the new model simply because I don't think the new model will have that big of a change in real-world performance versus the older model. So I actually do recommend this circular saw, and I would pick it up sooner than later simply because, well, they have a new model coming, so it'll be harder to find soon. So that's about it for this video. If you liked it, please like and subscribe, and we'll see you next time. God bless.